Hi, my name is Vanessa Tanner.
So I'm Byron Castellan. I'm a police officer in Windsor, Colorado.
My name is Amanda Basler.
This is Dr. Susan Entwistle.
I'm Kurt Owens. I'm Deputy Coroner for Texas County.
And the Death Investigation Training Academy was instrumental in helping me get the job that I needed in the field of death investigation.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coroner Talk. I love hearing from students that we have helped them in all the ways that we can, and we want to hear from you as well. If you've got a story to tell, if you've got a success story that our academy has helped you get your job, get your promotion, or whatever the case may be, reach out. We'd love to get you on the podcast and spend a few minutes talking about how we helped you and also spotlight you in your new career or your furtherance in your career, something like that. So we'd love to hear from you. So again, just let us know how we can help. Remember to check our website, the Academy website, for all the training that we have going on. Lots and lots of classroom, lots and lots of online training. And we want to do everything we can to make you a better investigator. And today is no different. Today we're going to be talking to Mark Bailey. Some of you have been in some of our classroom classes where Mark Bailey has taught statement analysis. He has also taught some overview of investigation classes, things like that. And I think he has a couple of online courses on our platform as well. So some of you know him. Others may not. And Mark is retired Marine Corps. He is an investigator. He teaches a lot of different topics around investigations. And one of his specialty is detecting deception, not only through visual cues, but more importantly, through handwritten statements. And he is an expert in that. Of course, he's not the only expert in the world, but he is an expert in that. And he does a very, very good job of teaching it. So today, he's going to be on the show. The show's going to be a little longer than what our past episodes have been because we're going to talk about some of the things you can look at in a handwritten statement to glean whether or not the statement is truthful. Now, obviously, taking a classroom class, he's got a class, it's a 3-day class that is fantastic, and you're actually analyzing actual statements and you learn a lot more. But just from what you're going to learn today on this episode, you're going to see things jump out at you on a written statement that's going to be like, oh, well, this is deceptive on its face, and then you can kind of go from there to decide if you want to go further or what questions you want to ask the person who wrote the statement. So lots of good training today. And so without any further delay, I'm going to jump into the conversation that I had with Mark.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
All right. As I pre-introduced, Mark Bailey is here in the studio with us. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm pretty good.
So, Mark, I introduced a little bit about what the topic is going to be and a little bit about you, but I probably didn't do it justice. So tell us a little about your career, kind of how you got started in statement analysis. And yes, I know using the Marine Corps, we will not hold that against you. Us Army guys will not hold against you that you're a jarhead. And now I probably just made half my listeners mad. They're jarheads.
That's okay. We'll redeem it.
But it's okay.
Yes.
It's okay, right? Because I don't know what they call us. What do you call us Army guys? I can't say it.
Think of
I'm sorry. I don't want the explicit tag on my podcast, so let's not do that. No, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of what brought you into statement analysis, things like that.
So I grew up in Georgia. My dad was in law enforcement, and I wanted to follow in his footsteps to some extent and find where I fit in law enforcement. So that my first thing right out of high school was to join the Marine Corps, get some experience, some education, and my goal was to get out and go into maybe working for the local sheriff's office and then see what happened after that. But I just never got out of the Marine Corps. And so I went from the ground side doing fun snake eater type stuff as a young sniper to being a military police officer after I got my education. And training was sparse in the Marine Corps at the time for, let's just say, line military police. Investigators got a lot of training a lot of times, and it also depended on what unit you were in. But long story short, I just sought my own training. And so I got myself into a few good schools as a young lieutenant, and also had some people that I worked with that I just latched onto and in an attempt really to learn and grow and make sure I'm giving giving the people that I'm responsible for everything that I can. And so that led me down a path of exploring more and more on investigations. And officers in the Marine Corps don't typically get to do investigations, but we manage those investigations. We lead the sections of investigators working in all kinds of different cases. And so for me, it was just doing my best to learn as much as I possibly could on the subject. And that really culminated in my finally getting accepted to the FBI National Academy in 2012. And in the National Academy, I basically wrote my own ticket on what classes I wanted to take, and the world was opened up with that school. It's a 10-week course. You're in class every day with some of the finest law enforcement officers from literally all over the world. We had 250 or so in our class. They were from all over the world. Every state was represented, and it was just a phenomenal experience. And my instructors were just amazing. Specifically, Miss Lisa Skinner. She will be. It'd be hard to top her as the greatest instructor I've ever had. And when she talked, I listened, and everything that she taught me, I put to practice immediately. Taught those things in the Marine Corps when I could. Outside of the Marine Corps, after that, I've just done everything I can to leverage that experience for other people, for agencies. I wrote my master's thesis on this stuff. It was, the Marine Corps sent me to school, and so I used that as time to continue that learning on this curve. So now I teach it whenever I can. I talk about it whenever I can, and I help folks with statements. Folks will send me statements and I just ask, hey, what do you think about this? And that's fun for me too.
And I know that when you do teach, you talk a lot about facial expression, body language, looking for deception in those areas, but then also analyzing a written statement.
Correct.
And that, I know we're going to talk about that just a little bit more, to how taking a verbal statement and transcribing it to a written statement isn't necessarily even as good as them putting pen to paper.
Very much so, yes.
So, and why we're talking about this? Well, our listeners are death investigators, police officers, and then there's some in supporting roles. But statement analysis, we don't have time today to go over all of it in detail, but certainly it helps people in employment situations, yes, criminal investigations, even a coroner investigator doing an investigation. If he or she asks somebody to write out a statement, there's a few things we're going to talk about today that can give them a pretty good indication of, well, I don't know that I necessarily believe what this person's telling me. On a broad view, what is statement analysis? I mean, we know a handwritten statement, but what are we doing? What is statement analysis from maybe a 20,000-foot view?
From the 20,000-foot view, it's initially understanding whether you're talking to someone who is exhibiting a deceptive behavior, like, lying to someone is a form of behavior. And so 20,000-foot view is you're initially looking for, am I talking to someone who's conveying information, truthful information, or am I talking to someone who's trying to convince me of something? And then just knowing that this person either can't or won't answer a question truthfully, it gives you an idea on who you're dealing with. And that's applicable to everything we do in life, our interactions with everybody that we deal with. And
when you're dealing with even verbal statements, I know we're talking about written statements, but you use the term conveying information or convincing information.
Right.
So I can remember, as you've raised teenage boys.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, you still have two littles.
Yep.
But you've raised boys,
mm-hmm.
and as teenagers, they come home and you ask them a question, and they are either going to convince you or just convey the information.
That's right. They're either going to answer your question or they're not in some form.
Yes. You left. You got off work at 7:00. It's 9:30.
Right. Where you been?
Where have you been?
Right.
So they're either going to just convey the information.
Correct.
They got off work. They went to Bob's house. They did whatever, or they've got to convince you of something
That's right. Trying to convince you that they weren't doing anything in the time frame that you're talking about.
Yes, and verbally, of course, that can be picked up as well.
Yeah.
So on its face, analyzing a written statement is taking a statement that someone has written, and you're going to look at some cues and some factors and decide this on its face is deceptive or not deceptive.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's areas you dwell into maybe a little bit more as well. But one of the big keys in analyzing a statement is to first off get the statement correct. Right. So for instance, if I'm an officer on the scene, if I'm a coroner on the scene, I don't want to tell somebody, okay, start at 6 a.m. today and go to noon and tell me what happened.
That's right. You don't want to influence their statement.
So basically, you slide a piece of paper to them with an ink pen and say, tell me what happened.
Correct.
They know why you're there.
Right.
Someone died. Someone got shot. There was a car wreck.
Yes.
A building fell down. They know why you're there. So tell me what happened.
Right.
They pretty much know.
Let them provide their story.
Yeah, and write it down.
And their story will tell you what's important to them from their perspective.
Okay, that's a good point. From their perspective, will tell you what's important to them. So there are three main indicators of deception in a statement.
Correct.
What are those three?
So the first one is what's called relative length of prologue, and that's not mine. That's from studies that I've read that I use heavily. So relative length of prologue, and what that is the beginning of someone's story, the intro, if you will. If the intro is longer than what actually happened and what they did after what happened, then that's a deceptive statement. So if the prologue, the front of the story, the intro is longer than everything else, if the emphasis is on everything that person did before the thing that happened, then that's a deceptive statement. And that's why getting their perspective and not influencing that in any way is important, because you don't want to say, starting at 6 o'clock this morning, tell me, you want them to tell you what's important to them. And so if they're presenting an alibi in their statement, it's going to show very, very quickly.
And that brings up another good point about 911 calls.
Oh, yes.
And there's a lot of schooling on 911 calls. But,
Correct.
But for those investigators out there listening, if you have a shooting, a child death, maybe if Grandpa didn't wake up in the morning, the case might warrant it, but probably not. But if there's any type of suspicious death, whatever, always get that 911
Yes.
call while you're at the scene.
Yes.
I don't like to get it 2 or 3 days later. They send it to me because I want to hear it right away.
Yes.
Back to your prologue statement. When someone making a 911 call and they have several sentences or minutes or statements, however long, prior to, and my wife is dead in the floor.
Correct.
Then, if I get home and I find my wife dead in the floor, I'm going to call 911. I'm going to be like, I just got home. My wife is in the floor. I can't get her to wake up.
Send an ambulance.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah. I'm probably not going to, I shouldn't be going on. I left the office at 4 and I went to the grocery store and then
Right.
if I've got all
Right.
that, and that is setting up my alibi
Correct.
or something.
Correct.
And so written statements, you're saying, is very similar to the 911 analyzing of the prologue, the pre-story.
Yes. And just before we leave this portion, 911 calls, you always ask yourself, is the call victim focused or caller focused? If it's caller focused, you got something you need to dig into. If it's victim focused, it's probably a legit call. And that's just that's again, 20,000 foot view, but is it caller focused or victim focused?
Right.
And so you're right. If you found one of your family members who you love that you didn't have anything to do with their demise, you would want them to get help. You want help to come and help that person, help the person that you love that's hurt. But if you've done something to bring that about, you're defending yourself already.
Right.
And so people will focus on themselves. I have a this. Well, that's different than my son is not breathing. That's victim focused. But if they say, I have a 2-year-old who was sleeping when I put him in the bed and now he's not breathing, that's they're saying this is what I have. And so the counter to that is my son's not breathing. I need help right now.
And people can say weird words. You take one sentence like, "Oh, wait, why would they do this to me?" Okay, that's caller focused. But if that's the only phrase they said, then maybe while they're waiting after they told it and they're waiting for something, and and 911 callers like to keep people on the phone, trying to do CPR and stuff, and they will or they won't, whatever. Mm-hmm. They might make that statement.
Sure, and it may be
that statement doesn't change the entire conversation.
Correct.
It's just how much they make it and how much weight throughout the entire statement and or call.
Yes. Is the call dominated by why would he do this to me? Why would he do this to me? I need to call somebody else. I need to get off the phone. It's very much that in this example, that's very much caller focused.
Yes, exactly. So, okay, so the three indicators of a deceptive statement. We talked about prologue, but then what's the other area?
So the next two, and they're pretty closely related, and they're equivocation and negation. And so equivocation is vague speech, maybe, probably, kind of, I think, sort of, it might have been. That's equivocation. It's just vague communication. They're giving you one word, and behind that one word, that one equivocation is a lot of missing information. And so when someone uses a lot of those phrases, and I just use one in normal talk, a lot is vague. But when you've got more than one of those on your statement that you're analyzing, maybe you have 7, 8, 10 of them. Maybe your statement is dominated with equivocation. That should be, you should know right away that you're dealing with a deceptive statement. Negation is what didn't happen versus what did happen. So when people say any version of no or not, so I couldn't. So couldn't is a contraction for could not. And so I couldn't get up. He wouldn't let me. And again, like Darren said, that one word here or there does not necessarily mean liar, liar, pants on fire. These things typically stack up. And so with all these three put together, we don't take any of these techniques as a standalone technique, so to speak, but there are some that are more important than others, it seems. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at the whole statement and taking into consideration how that person normally talks.
Not only how they talk normally or how the statement is written, but also, if I understand correctly, they can change that in midstream, where they can change adverbs and verbiage usage, or they can change the way they're referring. I think at one time in classes you talked about they're referring to
something.
My car, and then it was the car. Correct. That change might mean that, okay, it was my car until that car just ran over that kid, and all of a sudden it ain't my car,
that's
the car.
Yes, they give up ownership essentially.
They give up ownership,
it's
and
so
they've
easy
changed
to see.
that.
Yes.
And then negation is again
what didn't happen.
What didn't happen.
If you ask me a question and I've got no reason to hide anything from you, typically we're happy to tell the story, and we're active in the story, and that comes out, and this is what happened. But a lot of times when people attempt to deceive you, they will say this didn't happen or that didn't happen.
And we can't go into this topic very far, but there is a balance to prologue, incident, and epilogue.
Oh, absolutely.
An epilogue, of course, is the end of the story.
Correct.
Or what happened afterwards. Yeah. And so talk a little bit about that balance. Prologue is what happened before the incident, then the incident, whatever that is, and then after the incident.
Correct.
So
yes.
Talk a little bit about each of those and why balance there is important.
Okay, so in a normal story, normal's that's an interesting word. Came out of me, so I'll try to explain that there. In a normal story that somebody tells, there's a beginning, middle, and an end. There's an intro, a main body, and a conclusion. It's how we learn to tell stories. And most people will tell it that way. I was at such and such, this happened, and I done this. And, many times that's over the course of a 1-page or 3-page statement. But what you want to look at from the perspective of an investigator of any type, or anybody that just wants to know the truth, where's the emphasis of the story? And so a balanced statement, the emphasis should be on the incident. It should dominate the statement. So if you break a statement down and you partition it into those three specific parts, you have to find your incident first. Where, if it's a victim statement, where did they feel threatened and where did that threat leave them? And so everything in between there is incident, and everything before that is prologue, and everything after is epilogue. And so you do some math, you total up the number of lines that you have, and you divide those sections by those number of lines, and you get percentages. And so a balanced statement, for example, would be 20% prologue, 60% incident, and 20% epilogue. That would be great balance. And that should show you on its face that this person is being truthful with you. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some deceptive markers in their statement. We're still going to analyze the whole thing. But that balance is key. And so going back to something you said earlier about a verbal statement versus a written statement, if you don't contaminate that statement to the greatest extent possible, if you just tell somebody, tell me what happened, and you have a body-worn camera on or you have a recording device of some type, and they provide their statement, and you're not going, well, what about this and what about that? And did you say it was this time? What time was that? Don't guide them. Just say, tell me what happened, and let them provide their story. And if their story was all about what happened this morning before their neighbor got shot, and then they called 911, you got to wonder why the emphasis on what they did before and why the emphasis was not on their neighbor being shot.
And that doesn't mean, if you're wearing the body cam, you have a recording, you ask that question, let them tell their story. It doesn't mean after they're done, you can't go back
Correct.
and say, okay, let's go back to this. Now you can
Right.
ask your questions
Yes.
and you can verify.
Yes.
But you've got their statement ahead
Yes.
of time.
Yeah.
Now we can transcribe
Yeah.
it and we can do something with it.
Yes.
So I think what you're trying to say is ask your questions later. Don't interrupt them on the first run.
Correct.
Let
Yes.
them run through it one time.
Yes.
And then go back.
Right.
Otherwise, when you try to transcribe that, it's going to be two people talking. It's going to be a mess.
Yes. And again, you don't want to contaminate their statement. What's cool about these techniques are it doesn't matter who you are in law enforcement. I think they're applicable. And one of the things I teach in a longer course is I teach detectives, investigators, leaders to go back and teach their people how to take statements. And so you take the newest young law enforcement officer out of the academy and you put a uniform on them and a body-worn camera and you say, look, when you arrive on scene, you have to figure out what was going on. You have to maintain control of the scene. Here's the way to handle this with a witness. You've got somebody that says, hey, I just saw this happen. Say, okay, tell me what happened. And tell them not to talk until they're done telling their story. Then that they've gathered for you, the investigator, a beautiful statement potentially if they set it up right. And then some of these young folks are sharper than others, and some of them know naturally where to go back to in that story and what to look for, and they can ask their follow-up questions and develop even more information. We're not trying to cut them off and just say, you're just statement takers. We want them to be inquisitive and to solve crimes, but we can also teach them how to better take a statement. And that you almost can't say that enough. Don't contaminate the statement.
Right. And let the person just write the statement out.
Yes.
And then the officer can read it.
Yes.
If they want to ask the follow-up questions, they can.
Sure.
The statement is there so that
Yes.
the investigator or somebody else, can use that. So we kind of talk about deceptive statements some. Let me ask about, sometimes they're talking about suspect statements. Like I'm a witness, but I'm obviously a suspect. What about a victim? You mentioned victim. So
Yeah.
here we have a victim. Let's say it's a sexual assault. I say that I went out bar hopping, this girl paid attention to me, and then we ended up back at her place, and I was sexually assaulted. First off, if she didn't kill me, my wife would. So death will occur at some point, okay, if any of that story happens. But my point is, then I'm the victim. So I'm writing this statement that I met this girl named Susie. Me and Susie went back to her apartment and we were talking and this and that. But then I change from Susie to her. Or I say she did this or she did that. Or I start out with the she's and then change to, and then Susie took my belt off. And then whenever I change from either using the name to a pronoun or pronoun to a name, is that indicative of me changing for a reason? And what might that tell us?
Yes. So you gave, in your totally made up on the spot story there, you gave a lot of deceptive indicators already. Like that would be something that someone may lie about just so they don't get in trouble from their spouse to a cop. But the cop needs to know if they're lying. And that is something, quite frankly, we hear all the time. But when you look at, and with your story, you used a couple of different things. One of the things that you used was we. We denotes a relationship of some kind. Now, that can be a 5-minute-old relationship, or that can be a 5-year relationship. But at some point during that story, there was a we. We went back to her place or wherever you were talking about there, and then you changed it to then she did this and she did that. in truthful statements of sexual assault, many times they do start out as in a relationship. But they went out on a date, so there's a they. He picked her up, and now they're together. And even if they just met, they're together and they go places, and it would be normal for somebody to say we.
Because they have a mutual consent at that point.
Correct.
Yes.
There is, and they're joined in some way. They're together.
Where if they were kidnapped,
there's no we.
There might be the thing that we drove for an hour. He drove for an hour, and then we stopped for gas. But then if you say that one statement may not, that one word, then we stop for gas, may not change the entire statement. But at that point, they are putting themselves into a relationship. Doesn't mean they're not lying.
Correct.
One time.
Yes. And again, we don't look for one, we don't do one technique. We do a whole bunch of them, and they all check each other, essentially, these techniques do. And so there's a lot in what you just said there with truthful in reference to truthful statements. But the bottom line there is, if it's a truthful statement, it's going to be focused on the incident. So you will have good balance. With truthful statements, you see details. And you don't see details in deceptive statements. Remember what we said about equivocation. It's vague communication. Well, with truthful statements, you'll have details. You'll have unique sensory detail. I heard, I smelled, it felt like this. There will be sensory details, whereas if it's a fabricated statement, that the teller of the story doesn't have those sensations that they can even talk about. And so we just see these in the truthful statements that we have. And you take adult sexual assault type crimes. There's an element of shame there. There's an element I don't want the community to know about this, and so there's still a little bit of sometimes an element of deception. The victim may not want everybody to know all of their business, and so that doesn't mean that you're talking to a liar. That may mean that you're talking to somebody that doesn't want everybody to know their business. The investigator's goal is to find the real information and to develop the details that will help them essentially work that case to fruition, to conviction.
An example of a sexual assault case I worked a few years ago, and it come to mind because it's kind of what you were just talking about. Their statement was, the female statement was basically along the lines of, she had went to this bar and she was just dancing and meeting people. She talked about that, and she had met this guy, and she called out his name. I think his name was Mike. She met Mike, and she said she's something like, Mike and I danced and we drank, but then it was time for me to go home, and I was going to call for a ride, but Mike agreed to give me a ride home. So we walked out to the parking lot. I got in Mike's car, and Mike was driving me home. But, Mike had turned off on this road, and they pulled off the side of the road and then made me get out of the car. Then she continued talking that, he wanted to force her. He wanted to ask her for intercourse. I think she said, I want to F you, and told that story and told the story that I convinced him that I had a venereal disease, and that if I could pleasure him by my hand, and I think what she said was, I have a venereal disease, but if you want something, I can jack you off and I can take care of. And somehow she told this whole story. But her statement or her story, there was we talk about the prelude. The prelude was still just, I was at a bar, I was dancing, I met Mike.
Right.
I in that case, I think she was still considering part of the incident, because she had to set up the fact, I say set up, not as deceptive, but if she would have just started, Mike pulled over the side of the road, we'd have been, wait, where did this Mike come from? Because you just indicated the relationship, like you said, we don't know where it came from.
Right.
But her statement flowed very well. And in fact, she even goes on to say that after she was done, he had given her a towel to clean up with, and she cleaned her hand off, but not completely, and she left some DNA evidence in the palm of her hand. And when she was get away from him, she called 911 and turned the DNA evidence over to the officer, which the officer did not want, by the way.
Right.
But it was collected. It was a good case. The guy's in prison. He had some other sexual assaults pending on another case. But the point that I make about that is, even though there was some prelude in that, everything flowed. Her timing was right. She identified the guy just because she met him.
Right.
And
there you're talking about some understandable like, I don't want to really tell you everything that happened type stuff.
Right.
But she, in that case, if you just think about a person in that situation, they know that they've got some credibility gap to overcome because they did actually do something as part of that incident. Now, is it justified? Maybe. Did it keep her from getting raped? Probably. Did it keep her from getting killed? Maybe. But she knows that that's a hurdle that she's got to clear with investigators and trying. People want to be credible witnesses, and sometimes they got stuff going on in their life that make that hard to be a credible witness, a credible victim. And so, no, that's a good. I would love to read that statement, and so I'll just go back to what you said in the beginning there about her statement flowing. I wonder how many cops had talked to her before she wrote her statement. So, how much contamination did we unwittingly introduce to that statement? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
you mentioned the cop didn't want to take the evidence. So she's already been in contact with a cop there. She came forward in some way and said, hey, this just happened and I have this. So she's already potentially interacted with some folks that might have inadvertently messed her story up a little bit.
Right. And that's one thing us as investigators can do is by asking questions in certain ways, we can change somebody's statement.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Or, somebody else said it was this. Are you sure it wasn't that? And we can change people because people, they number one, they want to please us in one way.
Yes.
Okay. But then if we're planting something in their head, they're likely to go along with that.
Yes.
Whether they're trying to be deceptive or not, we can alter things. So, yeah. So that's where tell me what happened.
Right.
It's just
right.
First and foremost.
Yep. Don't contaminate it. Get it from them. I was thinking about this as you were talking there. Somebody tells a law enforcement officer they're telling about an assault of some type, and they say, and he hit me. And then if you don't just continue to listen, if you followed up with in the face, and they go, oh yeah, you've just totally given them an answer that now you don't know if they had it or not before you supplied it to them. And I see it. I see it sadly in so many child cases when a child is being interviewed forensically, by some type of child advocacy center. And some of those investigators, they've had to have some kind of training to be doing what they're doing. But sometimes they supply the answer for the kid because they have some background on the case from the real investigator. And I'm not saying that derisively, but I see that way too much. Them contaminating a kid's statement. And when you're talking about somebody who's 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, it's very easy to supply with them with information. And so, again, I harp on that very, very heavily in class.
Yeah, so it's important that we just let them write the statement but
yes.
before they're contaminated.
Yes, correct.
So you started a little bit, and I cut you off a while ago. Give us some ideas of what a truthful statement would contain.
Detail. Unique sensory and special
balance?
detail. It would be balanced, yes.
Okay.
So again, focused on the incident. So there's the example of 20% prologue, 60% incident, and 20% epilogue.
And you're making those numbers up just about on the perfect world.
Yes.
I mean, it could be a little shorter, higher, whatever.
25, 50, 25. It could be.
But if you have 20% prologue, 20% incident, and 60% epilogue, that's not balanced.
The relative length of your prologue is still off one way.
Yeah.
And if you see a super long epilogue, yes, typically people are trying to cover for that time after the incident. Yeah. And again, should show you that the person's trying to deceive you in some way or another.
Right. And in some way, you talk about detail. Detail is important. But sometimes, as an investigator, especially on the law enforcement side, sometimes detail can be too detailed. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't need to know the color of the wall and that you got under the third desk from the southeast corner. Sometimes when you put too much detail in, I'm going to look at a statement and go, that's a lot of stinking detail. I mean, you're giving more detail than needs to be. I heard the shots. I heard this, whatever. I dove under the nearest desk I could find. That's one thing. But if you start talking to me about more than that, and again, not one statement, not one phrase, but if the whole statement has a lot of tiny, tiny detail, in some ways, I want to look at that statement and say, That seems deceptive to me because you're putting in a lot of detail to convince me that you're telling me the truth.
I can see what you're saying, and that's a potential, but I've not run across a statement that looks like that. And by the time you get to that part of the analysis, you also you already checked it for balance. You've looked at some other indicators of either truthfulness or deception. And so here's another thing. Trauma has a different effect on people. It affects everybody differently. Trauma to some people makes their sense of, their senses more heightened, and they absorb more, they know more about what was going on around them. Trauma for some people makes them totally tunnel vision on the threat, and they wouldn't have potentially details on the stuff around them. They would just be focused on the threat. And so some of these things will be appropriate in the context of their story, but if there's a lot of detail in their story, there's a reason it's there. And it may be because they're trying to convince you that they were actually there or something, but there will be other deceptive indicators in that statement, not just that one that is off, if that makes sense.
True. Okay. We've talked about victims and suspects. Does this work on witnesses? You have 5 people at the same scene and you give them all paper. They're just witnesses. We don't think they did anything wrong at all.
Right.
Does it work on witnesses? Does it work for pre-employment or employment issues?
Yeah.
Or is it just a criminal thing?
No. So witnesses, that's, and we'll just stay criminal there for a minute, but a witness to some type of criminal incident. What you would look for is a focus on what they saw. And if you, let's say your patrol officers have responded to an incident and they have 5 witness statements, and you look at all of them and you go, everybody's focused on the incident. Those are good, probably going to be good witnesses. If there's 3 of them that were deceptive statements and 2 that were legit, you want to talk to those 2 that have legit stories first to see what detail you can glean from them, because you'll know more about what to ask once you read their statement. But those 3 that aren't telling the officer the truth on scene, you got to figure out why. And were they involved? Were they there for righteous reasons or probably not? And so it does. It works for victims, witnesses, or suspects. And so moving on to your next part of your question on pre-employment, when we do pre-employment screenings, what we're looking for is an individual who can tell the truth. And there's an element of deception, in daily life. We don't tell everybody everything that we're thinking. We try to keep some things to ourselves. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all type stuff. But we want someone, if they work for us in law enforcement, it's important that they can tell us the truth. It's important that they don't hide their junk from us. We need to know what their junk is before they come to work. Everybody's got stuff that they've done in their past. We need an idea of what it is, and we need to make sure that we're not hiring somebody who's going to get, caught for you name the crime later on down the road. And so in pre-employment screenings, the agency basically determines here are the things that we want to know about. So let's just talk about drug use. As marijuana becomes more and more legal all over the place, and our stance on some drugs are changing. But you want to know if this person smoked crack yesterday. And I'm being a little facetious there, but you want to know if you've got a drug user that wants to go to work for your agency, whether that's on the road or in the jail or in dispatch. You want to know what you're dealing with. So you ask them these questions in a way, and you don't have to do a polygraph or a CVSA. They're nice, but you can ask somebody the questions and just look for deceptive indicators in their speech. And cops are typically already pretty good at this stuff, and that's why you just teach them a few of these techniques, and man, they're off to the races. But you could set up an interview to where you ask specific questions. Have you ever committed insurance fraud? Have you ever stolen anything over $500 in value? And those are questions that they're pretty easy for you to tell if they're giving you. Are they trying to convince you that they're not a knucklehead, or are they conveying information? And so those are handy, and we really should do that with everybody we hire. We don't, sadly. Do we interview people? Yes. I have a friend who hired a kid after somebody else done a board interview, and they said, "Yep, we want to hire this guy." It was for a position. I want him. It was for a position in the sheriff's office. So they hired him, and then 2 days later, he got around to doing this kid's background check, and he had a sexual offense in his. Why was that not a question of the board? And so my buddy is in this position where we've already hired this kid, and now I find out he's got a criminal record. Why did he even get past the board? Why did I ever do anything to bring him on board with the sheriff's office? And so anytime I think we can screen our people before we hire them or screen folks before we hire them is a good idea.
So if you'd ask me about drug use and I'd say something like, no, I've never really smoked marijuana.
That tells me that you have, because, and the reason you say that, the reason I say that is I've never really. So
Yes.
really is a minimizing adverb.
Yes.
I've never really
Yes.
done that.
And I said that statement on purpose. I will just tell you, the listeners, I've never smoked pot.
Right.
I never have. And again, I always qualify this by saying in high school, my friends drank beer and smoked cheap cigars. I'm not going to say this. My friends didn't have a joint that I might not have tried it. I'm not saying I'm holier than anybody else.
Right.
I'm just saying we underage alcohol and smoke cigars. So again, then I joined the Army, and then I'm in the police field. So no, once I started that, I wasn't going to get caught on a drug test. So no, I've never smoked marijuana.
Right.
But when I said that statement, again, that was why I said that.
Yeah.
And I think you've made in class one time you talked about hanging out with certain friends or whatever, and someone said something to the effect of, no, I really don't hang out with them much anymore.
Correct. Yeah.
And obviously that was, yes, you do.
Yes. You did probably today before you came into the interview.
Yes.
That's what that really means. And so that's from a pre-employment, and it was known criminal associates. And we talked about specific people. He gave them to me. I asked him an open-ended question, who are your friends in high school? And pretty soon it was obvious that he wasn't going to be able to answer that question. No. And so I had to dig into why. And that was his ultimate statement, because he couldn't pass that question on a CVSA. And I said, okay, tell me more about this. And he talked about things that he does do and things that he has done in the past. But I don't really hang out with those guys that much anymore. It's like he just kept giving me equivocation and editing adverbs and minimizing adverbs. And those are indicators of deception. And it's part of the trouble is we hear it all the time, and we just know that folks are lying to us. Now, how do you exploit it is the real question.
Yeah. And if you was to ask me, have I ever stolen over $500 from an employer? No, I don't think I ever did. Again, I don't think I ever did.
Right.
I know if I did or didn't.
Right.
So if I say I don't think I ever did,
right.
There's don't is
there's your negation. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And
I think I would know. I would know.
Right. That's an equivocation.
So
and that's just a beautiful example of, if you haven't stolen $500, you've not stolen $500.
Right.
But if you flirted with that line of, I used to steal small stuff, but let's see, I don't think I've ever stolen anything like that. I pre-employment one time, on a pre-employment screening, you're looking for information from up front to get past some of that nitpicky stuff, the stuff that we're not worried about. Everybody does crazy stuff when they're kids. But a guy said, I've never stolen anything of that value, but a guy did, he bought a four-wheeler from me and he didn't pay me. And so I went and took it back. And so he was worried that question was going to trip him up. But once he got that
it would have tripped him up on the CVSA had you not got it out.
Had I not talked about it before.
And then he passed.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right. Because in his mind, he was still concerned, well, I did kind of steal it. He didn't think it was stealing it, but yet, maybe. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
CVSAs are fun, and I know that's not what we're here to talk about, but the two work hand in hand.
Right.
If you understand one, you can understand the other.
Sure. Okay, use of time. That's another question. I know we're getting close on our time here, so I'll make this quick. But use of time. So there's a couple different things. One, if you're using what you call o'clock time, like I arrived home at 4:30 p.m.
Correct.
As opposed to it was about an hour and a half.
Correct.
So there's two different uses of time there.
Yeah.
What does it mean to us as investigators?
So with the technique I teach, we look at o'clock time. And so if they write in their statement, just like you said, I got home about 4:30 p.m. So they gave, for one, about is an equivocation before the 4:30 p.m. But I note that 4:30 p.m. on their statement. And let's say 6 lines down, they say something in reference to 6:30 p.m. So now we've got 6 lines going from 4:30 to 6:30. So now let's see the next time they mention time is 8:30, but instead of 6 lines, they use 32 lines. So in the first 2-hour period, it was 6 lines. In the second 2-hour period, now it's 32 lines. So
Now,
why the change of pace?
But if they had said they got home around 4:30, they went into the bedroom, changed their clothes, lay down and took a nap, got up. Well, now maybe you're accounting for that, but of course that's the rarity, I know.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're trying to tell a story of their activity, what you're saying is if they're up, active, doing an activity, they're only got 4 lines for 2 hours and 32 lines for. There's obviously something going on in that time.
Yes, you want to know why they changed pace in their statement. It's important. Again, it's their story. It's important to them. Why is it important? And what can you get out of that? How does it fit in? How does that detail fit into everything else that you know as the investigator about the case? And it's just, I'll tell you again, what you commonly see is deceptive statements, and you see the usage of time or o'clock time in the prologue, and then during the incident, you'll see no time. And then in the epilogue, they'll use time again. Sometimes they won't after the prologue. Sometimes in the epilogue, they use it when they called 911 because they know you know that time.
Right.
They know you know when they called the cops. So it's just once you execute these techniques, it literally jumps off the page at you and you can't miss it. Now you're like, oh, I read this before, but now that I see it and I've got these other things to bounce it off of, this makes sense to me. And now you can strategize. What am I going to go after here? What are my follow-up questions? Who's going to ask the questions? Am I even the right guy to ask the questions of this person? Do we need to set this interview up for a later time, or do we need it in a different place? If you're in the guy's living room, you might want to set something up for later. It depends on the situation. But the point is, the more information you have, the better your interview will be, and the better your interrogation will be.
Because you got time to prepare.
Correct.
Now that you have a statement. So.
Correct.
Well, look, we're close on our time, Mark. Thank you so much for stopping by and talking about this. So I know that you teach this. You have several classes around Missouri, and I know the last one I went to, there was people from other states there. People come all the time. You're a great instructor, and it's a 3-day class that you normally teach. And I know you'll take that class somewhere else if somebody wants it as well. But do you have a website, or where can someone go to find out more about you, more about this statement analysis class, things like that?
Yes, I do. So if you go to wetrainlawenforcement.com, that will land you on my website. And of course, folks can get a hold of me if you leave my contact information on this podcast. But one of the things I have a burden to share this information with people. And so sometimes some of the people that want the information their department can't afford to send them to Springfield, Missouri, or wherever. But sometimes their department can afford to bring me up there and have other folks come into the class. And so I desire to bring this to wherever people want to listen. And I do. I teach it a couple of times a year at MOCIC in Springfield, Missouri. And I like those folks. They have a great training facility. It's close to me. I also have several that I'm setting up with departments all around the country right now. But if they'll go to my website, they can see training opportunities coming up. Yeah.
And I know being in your class, you're doing homework day one.
Yeah.
The student is.
They love it, by the way.
And it's a 3-day class. The student's doing homework day one. And what I mean by that is, you're giving them a laminated card with everything. We talk about colors, and you're talking about highlighting things in orange and green, and underline one thing in green, and highlight another thing in green, and box things in orange, and none of that I understand what I'm talking about at this point because I forget it all. However, with this cheat card, it tells you.
Right.
And you can follow along line by line.
Correct.
And you talk about that, and day one, students are going back to the hotel or back to their house or whatever,
with
and
reading.
they're analyzing statements.
Yeah, with
and
reading.
And then the next day, you're looking at it again.
Right.
And by the time they're done on that 3 days, they've analyzed truthful statements and deceptive statements, and in class we've talked about it. So they're not going to go away with I don't know if I really got that.
Yeah.
they got it because they're doing it.
Yeah. And day 3, I'm grading their homework in the morning, and we're talking about maybe something in the statement that one or two of them missed and why they missed it. And I assign those things very, very purposefully. And people do. They walk away with a real skill. And it's hard to cram that much training into 3 days. But again, I'm trying to meet a need out there. And a lot of times agencies don't want to send their officer away for a full week. Sometimes, a travel day on Monday and a travel day on Friday, that's with 3 days in between, is about all they can afford to have that officer gone. And I understand that.
And again, we haven't talked enough about today to necessarily make somebody expert, but just knowing that the prelude, the incident, and the epilogue, if the balance isn't right, that's a problem. Yeah. If they've got, if their timing is wrong, if they refer to something possessive and all of a sudden get rid of it.
That's right.
Just those things are like, this stands out as I don't know. Yeah. Well, now if it stands out as I don't know, now you know enough to find somebody in your area or find somebody who can look at the statement.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's one of the things, again, I enjoy is I'll have jurisdictions call me up after training and say, hey, I've looked at this. I think this. Can you just give me an idea on what you see here? I love doing that. That's a lot of fun. Helping solve cases is great. And so I really enjoy giving back in that way.
Right. Well, fantastic. Well, we'll have all of your contact information in show notes. So even if you're on a mobile device, a listener can look at the notes and see all that. You can go to the website, coronertalk.com, find it all there. We'll have all your links there, everything where people can find your courses, hook up with you, whatever else. So, Mark, again, thank you for stopping by. Hopefully we can have you back on the show in the future, talk about more of this kind of stuff and maybe some other training topic as well.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm back with you live here, so to speak. Well, as live as I can be. I'm more live now than the episode you listened to because there was a few days apart in the recording. Isn't it interesting how these recordings work? You're hearing it all the same time, and yet the conversation I had with Mark was several days prior to what I'm talking to now. And what's interesting is whenever I try to plan these out around Christmas or whatever else, I might be talking about Christmas around Thanksgiving. You just never know. So, but I really love the medium of podcasts where we can record shows and then get them out to you at a time scheduled drop. And then you don't have to listen to them right then. You can listen to them whenever you have time or come back to them or whatever. So podcast is a great medium. So I hope you enjoyed that interview with Mark. I know you learned something. We broke it down to a point that at least you learned something on how statements can be deceptive on their face. And Mark is a very good instructor. He breaks it down very easily, and I'm glad he took the time to stop by the studio and make some time for you. So as we get closer to Christmas, again, your Thanksgiving is behind us. In America, we celebrate Christmas. Some of the other countries do as well. Not every country that we have on our listeners, but most do. And as you get closer to Christmas, we need to keep our mind focused on what Christmas is about. It's not just about gift giving, although that's important. It is about Christ, and we need to stay focused upon that. And one way we can do that, of course, is to be a blessing to others. Now, regardless of what faith you are, during this Christmas season, you still have, I feel, an obligation to show kindness, to show an extra amount of blessing this season or this time of the year than you would any other time of the year. So find ways to bless somebody, whether it be just with a smile or whether it be financially, whether it be help somebody's heat bill or something like that. Find a way to bless someone. You don't need the credit. No one needs to know you did it. Do something for somebody else, and I guarantee you it will come back to you tenfold. Until next week, everybody, be safe.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production. Visit our website at coronertalk.com. And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coronertraining. 3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.